Oh, no.
Okay, great. I'm going to start by orienting us to some of the access tonight. So first, Angie Lang is with us and she's providing live captioning. If you require captioning, you can select the closed captioning, the CC button on your Zoom menu bar. We also have two ASL interpreters, Yonah and Joanne. We're not certain that you can pin both those, both their screens. So we're going to suggest that you use gallery view. The rest of us will turn off our video cameras when we're not, our video feed when we're not speaking. The event is also being recorded tonight. We think we're going to be together for approximately 2 hours. The first half are the panelists and almost the second half will be discussion. We want to remind you that because we are being recorded, if you type in the chat or you voice comments or questions, those two will be recorded. A final note, we'd like you to know that when you type in the chat, because we're in a Zoom webinar, it automatically only goes to the panelists. And if you want all the attendees to see your comments, you must select attendees instead of panelists. So good evening. My name is Esther Yanni, and I'm the director and an associate professor in the School of Disability Studies. My pronouns are she, her, and for those of you who can't see me, I'm a white woman with shoulder-length dark brown hair, pronounced eyebrows, and I have brown eyes. One of my eyes is scarred such that it gives the appearance that my eyes are different colors. I'm really pleased to welcome everyone here this evening to Disruptive Anthologies, a roundtable about publishing at the intersection of queer theory and disability studies. Before we begin, I want to give a land acknowledgement. So Toronto and Ryerson University is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. The Dish Territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississauga, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and to protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and people, Europeans, and newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Now, we start with this formal Ryerson land acknowledgement as a way to acknowledge Indigenous presence and as an effort towards reconciliation with Indigenous people. It is a way for us to assert Indigenous sovereignty over the land on which we are learning, writing, working, and loving. Within the School of Disability Studies, we use a land acknowledgement as a practical way to think about land disablement and the way that dispossession from the land, destruction of the land, and cultural genocide are tied to the disablement of all peoples, Indigenous peoples. Land acknowledgements are a way for us to begin to articulate our solidarity with Indigenous movements, in particular, the protests against the killing of Indigenous people in police interactions, our solidarity with the Six Nations land defenders in 1492 land backlaying, and in solidarity with the Mi'kmaq fishers' resistance to settler terrorism in Nova Scotia. We continue this work as we engage with Indigenous elders and leaders, both in our classrooms and our communities. So I want to turn now to tonight's roundtable. Tonight's roundtable, as many of you know, was organized by Dr. Ricky Varghese, who's the Tanis postdoctoral fellow in gender, disability, and social justice. The Tanis postdoctoral fellowship provides an opportunity to an emerging scholar who's working in the area of disability studies to mobilize and animate the work that is consistent with the philosophy of the School of Disability Studies. In particular, our work towards engaging with and transforming exclusionary cultural, social, and political systems. Now, Tanis Doe herself was a Fulbright scholar and worked as a professor in many universities across Canada and the US. She was a deaf and disabled Métis woman, and she was widely respected for her activism and her participation in social movements at the intersection of feminism, queer rights, and disability rights. I'm sure she would have been very interested in Ricky's work, and she certainly would have loved tonight's event. Dr. Varghese, who, like Tanis, is a social worker and a psychotherapist, is going to use his postdoctoral fellowship to complete a book project about masculinity, suicide, and the death instinct. We've been thrilled to have Ricky work with us since May and look forward to working with him for the next 18 months. I'm sure you'll appreciate the care he's taken in tonight's roundtable and know that it reflects his interdisciplinary work and his ties to social justice work. Thank you, Ricky.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for that introduction, Esther. Before I start, I want to give you a visual of what I look like. I'm a South Asian man with dark brown skin, originally from India. I have a visible disability on my face, around my chin that affects my speech. So I have been told that people come to understand me after a while getting used to hearing me talk. I have short hair, well, very short, a beard, and it's like black eyes. I go by he, him, it, and pronouns. I want to take this opportunity to thank everyone for attending what I hope will be a stimulating discussion about the academic publishing industry, with a focus on how to go about editing an anthology, particularly those anthologies that address issues and topics that are generally considered marginal in mainstream forms of knowledge and research. I want to also take this opportunity to thank the wonderful participants I have been able to bring together to form this roundtable. Each one of them will speak to their own experiences within the context of either editing or participating in putting together an anthology. Each of them brings to this conversation their unique and distinctive perspective, and I'm very grateful to be able to share this virtual space with all of them. So, a bit about how we will proceed for the evening as follows. So, Helen Clark, Christien Garcia, and I will speak about experiences working on Law, which is a book that I edited. And it came out, it was published by the University of Regina Press in November of last year. feels like a whole other lifetime ago. And OmiSoore Dryden and then Daly will speak to their experiences as editors to their own respective anthologies and the presses they look with. My hope is that our diverse experiences and work-related trajectories will give all of you a sense of what editing a collection of essays might look like. Once we're each done with our respective speaking segments, we will have a broader discussion between the five of us for a bit, and then we will open up the floor for any questions or further discussion points from the audience. So Law, I'm a copy of it. Law, I have been working on topics in sex, sexuality, and in sexual health for a while now, both in my work as a practicing therapist and social worker, and in my academic research. Over the years, I had a few opportunities to organize panels, roundtables, and talking engagements, specifically on the subject of barebacking, otherwise known as sex without condoms. I became interested in the topic itself because I noticed that it was something that would often come up in conversations within my practice and within the community spaces that I occupied with other gay men and men who have sex with men. I found that many people didn't know exactly how to talk about it or how to approach the topic. It felt very taboo. Having had the opportunity to organize a few panels on the subject allowed me to bring together a range of scholars and community workers who work on sexual health to speak on the topic. It quickly became apparent to me that there was a whole slew of people who were interested in the subject matter and others took notice of this as well. Most importantly, my friend and colleague, Jonathan Allen, a professor at Ryerson University in Manitoba. Jonathan had participated in two of the panels that I had organized and had around 2014, 2015, been appointed as series editor for the Exquisite Corpse series at the University of Regina Press. Having known about some of my work in organizing a series of conversations on the subject of barebacking, he encouraged me to consider putting together an edited collection where I could collectively showcase the works of some of the participants of these speaking engagements. At first, I was hesitant. Books about sex, books about queer sex. I didn't think it would be of any interest to many. I thought that even in the space of mainstream queer theory or LGBTQ studies, conversations about sex are often relegated to margins of conversations about all conversations about sex are considered subcultural. I'm thinking of India's famous seminal book on barebacking here, Unlimited Intimacy, Reflections on Subculture Barebacking. Mainstream queer theory, in my opinion, tends to have a respectability problem, as in it's very invested in appearing respectable. So I was ambivalent about how a book on a marginal topic in an already marginal field like queer theory or political sex studies would be received. With Jonathan's encouragement, he told me about the Exquisite Corpse series at the University of Regina Press and connected me with Karen, the acquisitions editor there. It seemed very excited about the idea of the book project. In fact, one thing that I learned about the whole process is to really do your research when selecting the press or publishing house you want to go with. working at a press like the University of Regina Press was an incredible experience precisely because they value cutting-edge work that isn't afraid of taking risks. Some presses are like that. They're willing to risk working with researchers who work on topics and subjects that other presses may be more hesitant to work with. I think this is a significant point to consider. If you have access to the lab and are interested in publishing your work to the press, I suggest going to their website and having a look over their list of publications. It will very quickly give a taste of what they might be into publishing and what they might not. This isn't a catch-all approach to publishing, but it definitely helps to do your research. Working with Karen and the editorial team at the University of Regina Press from the inception of the project to the end, a process that took us 4 years from start to finish, from 2015 to 2019, was an amazing learning experience precisely because it made me realize exactly how I wanted to be treated as a researcher by a press. They were open-minded to my ideas, were so very flexible and gave me a wide berth that respected how I imagined the project to flow and take shape. They were also all just so very nice. A quality that I think we often undervalue or underestimate in academia or in the real world in general. But I have come to see as a necessity when it comes to what it means to do a collaborative project. He touchstone when it comes to what I have learned through the process is to also be flexible and patient with yourself. Once I wrote up a call for submissions to the edited collection of essays, I took it upon myself to approach and invite some folks I felt I would like to include in the project. Most of the people I invited by email responded rather generously and in a manner that was supportive of the project. I quickly also realized that my role as the lead editor of the project is not that much different from the work of a curator of an art exhibit. Once the abstracts started coming in, and once I decided which pieces I felt spoke to how I imagined the project, how it flowed and appeared cohesive, I realized it was an exercise in creating an edited collection in which all of the essays were in conversation with one another. Flexibility and patience comes in precisely when you have to allow yourself the time and space to let the project take form. It might not always be very clear at first, but when you start to recognize common threads and themes, you'll see that the work starts beginning to make more and more sense. Patience also comes into the frame of the work because much of the time is spent waiting for the work to come to be. As I mentioned earlier, in our project took 4 years from start to finish. There may be long periods of time in which you find yourself waiting for abstracts to come in, waiting for the first drafts of chapters to come in, and waiting for the final revised versions of those chapters to come in. When things start coming in, there will be shorter periods of time in which much of the reading and editorial work will take place. Give yourself time to read, but also plan to be busy in shorter stints of time. Then you will have to turn around the email to the press on mutually agreed upon deadlines. Communication and management are key as well, especially in your role as the editor of the project. I'm a bit of an organizational fiend, so I enjoy this kind of work that involves making lists and making lists about making lists. And as an editor, you're also in the role of being a liaison between the press and the contributors to your book. I've always encouraged folks to be kind and generous in how you interact with all parties involved, even individuals who may appear to be blind your patience. I think being able to support your writers in the process will allow for the production of a stronger, more rigorous work, and will allow you to safeguard the relationships with colleagues whose work you appreciate and value. A final point I want to touch upon, which Karen might expand upon in greater detail in her remarks, is distinguishing yourself as editor from the business side of the publishing process. I had initially titled the law as Sex Academic Essays on Barebacking. University of Regina Press gently encouraged me to reconsider the title and suggested something shorter, more memorable, and captivating. At first, I was hesitant, but I quickly realized that pressers understand so much of the business and marketing side of the book industry, stuff that is often beyond the scope of the knowledge that academics and community organizers may have access to. It's important as an editor to know when to give up some of the reins of control to folks who may be better equipped and knowledgeable with respect to how to get your book to reach the largest audience possible. The response to the has been quite amazing, at least from what I know. Recently, there was a virtual conference hosted by the University of Exeter, Viral Masculinities, where half the book's contributors were invited to present their research. And I have heard from colleagues that they're using the book in their queer theory courses, and I have also been informed that some reviews of the book are coming out in journals like the ALS Quarterly and Summer Ethnics. I'll now introduce Karen, who present her remarks from the press side things. Karen is an acquisitions editor at the University of Regina Press, and I will let her speak.
Thank you, Ricky. Those were very kind words. Hi, everyone. My name is Karen Clark, and I'm the acquisition editor at University of Regina Press. It's situated in Treaty 4 territory. We're on the traditional lands here in Regina of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota nations, and it's the homeland of the Métis peoples. I thank Ricky for inviting me to be a part of this conversation, and I thank the organizers for hosting me and all of you for attending. To describe my visual person, I'm a white settler Canadian woman. I have blonde hair, which is way too long right now because of COVID, and I have blue eyes. My ancestors are from England, Ireland, and Scotland, so I have crooked teeth because of that. And I'm sitting in a very bare looking room because I recently painted and I can't bear to put nail holes in the walls given how much time it took me to fill them. Okay, so in 2016, as Ricky mentioned, University of Regina Press officially launched a new scholarly book series. And as he mentioned, it's called The Exquisite Corpse. Ricky's Raw is the third book in that series. This book series publishes scholarly monographs and edited collections that attend to all aspects of the human body from a variety of perspectives and disciplines. We like to say, like the surrealist parlor game, for which it's named. The Exquisite Corpse series ultimately seeks to present the body in all its unruly and corporal glory. So thus far, we've published 2 monographs in it. I'll just do a bit of showing. I'm just picking up certain books from the series. This was the first one, Reading from Behind, Analysis of the Anus by Jonathan Allen at Brandon University. The great thing about this series is other publishers are very interested in it. So we sell rights, which I'll talk about later, but this is what the Japanese version looks like, and the Z Books version. I'm holding up different books that show different publishers' interpretation of the covers. The second was an edited collection, Virgin Envy, Cultural Significance of the Hymen. I'm a little bit off my talking notes, sorry. And this was the Korean version. So Ricky's is the third collection, and we have one other monograph that's on the aging body. And as Ricky mentioned, Dr. Jonathan Allen at Brandon University is the series editor for this Exquisite Corpse. So for the publication of Raw, I will describe the process for the collection from where I sit as the acquisition editor. In 2015, Ricky sent me a draft of a call for papers that he was going to be sending out, and he asked if the press would be interested in it for the newly emerging Exquisite Corpse series. Upon receiving that call for papers, I met with the series editor, Jonathan Allen, and the director of the University of Regina Press, and we all agreed that it was definitely a book that we wanted to support and see included in the series. I then sent some feedback to Ricky, noting that we were interested and would support it, but that we also wanted to encourage the contributing writers to imagine that they were writing for a more general audience if they could, asking the authors to try to avoid what we sometimes call in-house as academic jargon, and I apologize for that term, but we at the press are trying to reach a broader audience to inform the public of something so important as health and sexuality. So I certainly supported the project. University of Regina Press is trying to do books that matter. And so when we ask for a more general writing style, it's because we are trying to bring that work that's produced in the academy into a larger reading public. Our mandate at the press is to have the work being done in the humanities to be accessible, as opposed to sometimes alienating in its delivery of its knowledge and research. And our motto is a voice for many peoples. And certainly, so something like Raw, where Ricky's talked about more marginalized voices or more marginalized research that might be seen as not respectable. We push back against that, and that's what we want to champion. Besides asking for the writers to consider the writing style and keep in mind that broader audience to whom they would speak, the other guidelines I gave Ricky at the time was regarding word count. We ask for our manuscripts to reach around 80,000 words. 80,000 words produces a book for us that's affordable and has this this tradey feel to them. They're not massive tomes, or they don't look, I don't know, pretentious, scholarly, or really serious, so to scare people away. Ricky mentioned, I'm off my notes a little bit again, but Ricky mentioned the business side. And so the cover of the book and the title of the book are in the purview of the publisher. We have to have the cover and the title function in other ways than just to capture closely the content. So a book that's 140,000 words becomes unwieldy and very expensive to produce. If you can imagine the shipping costs alone for that weight of a book. And so University of Regina Press doesn't want to be pricing books only for the library market. Those books are often like $120, and we're trying to keep our books $25 to $35. Other guidelines that I sent Ricky was about curating the collection, as he said, working so that the parts put together become something more than just those parts. So he worked certainly from the start with a thematic thread and a vision for the collection that puts in the connective tissue. So all those pieces, all those essays come together to form a whole. And this is very important for an edited volume to succeed in the review and book buying world. It makes the book matter as a book, as opposed to being a collection of essays that could easily have been separated or published as independent journal articles. It's important to curate them, and they make meaning together. So identifying early on an arc or a thematic thread for the collection, even a disruptive one, is important. And of course, that can be changed and revised as the essays come in, but it is important to begin this way, as Ricky did. And then certainly writing an introduction helps make these pieces make meaning together. And inviting, as he did, Dean to write the afterword was a powerful way to tie up the contents, which is also important. Despite this disruption, there is a sense we have as publishers that there's still a need for a closure or a tying together that the reviewers still really look for in the readers. I'll just move it a little bit more quickly and maybe edit a few of my speaking notes. So simply when the manuscript comes in, Ricky, following the guidelines, he was so very organized, which is important. I look at the manuscript for things like permission issues, potential libel. I look at the bibliography and the notes. And then if it looks ready for peer review, I send it out through peer review. And I can talk about that afterwards in the Q&A. If everyone wishes to discuss peer review. But it is my job to vet the potential reviewers. I look at whether they're a good fit, if I think they're going to be a strong and helpful reader, a sympathetic reader. And for a University Press book, I need to secure 2 positive peer reviews that recommend publication before I can move forward with the project. Those reviews came in and I blinded them and sent them to Ricky. We discussed the comments, the suggested revisions, what is acceptable, what would make the manuscript stronger. If there's something that's not helpful from the peer reviewer, we can set that aside as long as we make a case for why that revision wasn't made. The most important thing in this point is Ricky sends a editor's response to the reader reports back, and it's important there to have a tone of gratitude. The peer review process, still to this day, folks want to see that it's been positive, that it led to the best scholarship possible. I then take the peer reports and Ricky's response in the revised manuscript to our publication board, faculty vet, and make sure I've done my job with selection of peer reviewers. And then they can either recommend officially publication, the faculty board can recommend with more revisions, or they cannot approve it for the press. That really rarely happens if I'm advocating for a project. The pub board is really supportive and usually trusts us and our vision for the press. Contracts are drawn up then, and again, I can talk about that if people would like to talk about contracts, and what we call Schedule A's, where the contributors give us the right they let us license their intellectual property. And then I transmit the book into production, and that's with permissions in, images in, agreements and contracts signed. And then it is, as Ricky said, a long process. The production process itself is about 9 months. So one of the reasons for that long process, there's page proofs and design and layout and indexing, but there's also what's called a long lead for the media. They want an advance galley 3 to 6 months before a publication date to line up publicity, media, book reviewers. So we build that into the process. We then send it out for readers and reviewers, to journals, for awards. So to just close, I'll share one anecdote that captures the unruly disruptive moment for me on this project. And again, there weren't many others because Ricky was a dream of a lead editor with whom to work. He's organized, thoughtful, communicative, kind. So it was really an enjoyable and smooth project for me. But my disruptive moment, a university IT staff person arrived suddenly one afternoon at my office, unannounced, saying very ambiguously that he had to fix or check something on my computer system. He gave no warning, nor did he say clearly what it was that he was doing. This hadn't really happened before except for once. So I had to go and get an office administrator to vouch that he was actually an IT person. I didn't quite believe him at first. So she said yes, and he's with IT. After about 15 minutes, he emerged from the office saying he was all done and thank you and nothing more. My managing editor came to me to ask what was happening, and I reminded her of the day before when a batch of images, they were film stills from one of the movies under discussion in one of the essays in Raw. Those film stills had come in via email to my computer, and I had downloaded them off of Dropbox or some such site. And then I was reminded that a similar situation had happened when working with Dr. Allen on his manuscript, Reading from Behind, about the anus. So those two books, the barebacking images that came with the chapter on the film, and Jonathan Allen's book on the anus, I guess sent off some flags for IT. So to close, University of Regina Press is so pleased to be part of this disruptive anthology in the series, and we look forward to more collaboration in the future. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Karen. Our next speaker is Christien Garcia. Christien is one of the contributors to the book. He is a University of Toronto Arts and Science postdoc fellow at the Center for Comparative Literature. His research looks to literature and visual culture to explore questions about the political meanings and limits of sex. He's currently working on a book about queer rooms in literature and film.
Great, thanks so much. People can hear me? I've done Zoom correctly? Okay. So to begin with a description of myself, I'm a white man and go by him, he, him pronouns. As a settler of Spanish and mixed European ancestry, I grew up in Alberta. I have dark hair and a beard. And just to give a sense not only of what I look like, but also how I like to appear, on Instagram, I post both indulgent selfies and landscapes. So this morning, thinking about this event, I had a quick search online to take a sample of what people have said recently about the state of edited collections within the culture of academic publishing. Not surprisingly, just as there are those perennial premonitions about the death of the university, the death of the library, the death of the academic journal, the death of the monograph. There has also been in recent years a debate online about the death of the edited collection. That being said, most of what I found were people speaking optimistically, especially from the humanities perspective, about the enduring merit and longevity of the format as compared to stock and trade, monographs, and journal publishing. So having been asked to speak specifically from the contributor's point of view, my hope this evening is to add to a conversation about the value of edited collections by briefly noting some of the rewards and maybe concerns as I see them of writing a book chapter. And for me, this is specifically within the areas of sexuality studies, literary studies, and film studies. I think on the whole, being a chapter contributor is really an enviable position, in as far as you get to reap the benefits of a collaborative project while being less responsible for a lot of the invisible labor that goes into bringing a book like Raw, Prep, Pedagogy, and the Politics of Barebacking to fruition. With that, I think comes particular responsibilities for the contributor, especially around deadlines and helping the project move forward in a timely way. So some of the benefits. Perhaps the most salient benefit of publishing a chapter in an edited collection is the opportunity to feature your research as part of a larger work that is itself a coherent intellectual project. So for example, for Ricky's collection, which I submitted a chapter to, on bareback sex, I could assume at the outset that I didn't have to convince my reader that the topic itself was important. And actually both Ricky and Karen kind of touched on this in their own presentations. I didn't have to kind of make a case for barebacking as a worthy academic topic in the same way I might have to if I was submitting a similar piece in, say, a film studies journal. Essentially, the volume editor and also the other contributors are going to be doing a lot of that context work for you, situating the debate, the literature, and the history of a given topic in the foreword or introduction. And this, I think, frees you up quite a bit. I reckon you have a bit more creative space as the writer of a chapter. Not all book chapters are the same, of course, but I think in general, the format offers more for writers interested in creative criticism and thinking creatively about how they present their research. This is something that a professor of education at the University of Nottingham, Pat Thompson, writing on the LSE Impact blog, agrees with. So to quote her, "A book chapter is a good way into alternative modes of academic writing. It's a place where you can think and do much more about the writing aspect of academic writing. It's a place to focus directly on the reader rather than primarily on the referees. It's a place to practice and develop the craft of authoring," end quote. Being a contributor to a collaborative project like an edited collection also leads to professional networking opportunities. Not only making new contacts with fellow researchers and contributors, acquisition editors, presses, but also the opportunity to have your work sit alongside recognizable names in your field, even if they remain people who you've never actually met. Contributing to an edited collection also gives you the opportunity to gain feedback throughout the evolution of a specific piece of writing. For someone like me who has completed their PhD but doesn't have the benefit of a permanent university position and thus a relatively captive group of colleagues to call on, getting such feedback on written work isn't always easy. And I can definitely speak in relation to my experience with Raw that this was really one of the most valuable aspects of working with Ricky, was that sort of ongoing feedback. Arguably, this kind of peer review to come out of writing a chapter can be a lot more beneficial than the 2 or 3 vague paragraphs you may get from an anonymous journal reviewer. So on the topic of how to garner the most visibility for your work, collections versus journals, this is where personal opinions and experiences vary. But in my case, my chapter in Raw has definitely had more of a creative afterlife when compared to those articles I have published in what I would call fancy journals. Press marketing, the book launch event, even the cover design helped to counter the feeling one sometimes gets as a researcher of publishing into a void. So just to conclude the kind of benefits heading, I wanted to end with a sort of a pro tip, something that I learned and found really useful this past year as I was being asked to submit writing samples while applying for a bunch of postdocs this past year. When I asked the folks at the University of Regina Press for the proofs of my chapter to submit as a writing sample, it was actually them who offered to include the book cover, the cover design, as well as the table of contents, along with my contribution in a single tidy PDF. I suspect this was particularly helpful for one of the postdocs that I applied to that was based at a cultural institution rather than a university. The cover design, I think, gave my writing sample visual appeal that could help situate my academic writing as part of the kinds of cultural and public debates that this particular center is known for. And with the table of contents, I had an extra opportunity within my larger application to demonstrate my work's association with well-known scholars in the field of sexuality studies. So to move on to maybe some concerns or challenges. As I alluded to earlier, I mean, Ricky was mentioning how organized he is. I'm not so much the case. It's not so much the case with me. So the deadlines can sometimes be challenging. There can be a lot of periods of waiting for proofs and feedback, and then periods of rushing to meet deadlines, especially near the end of the project. So associated with this is the need to be able to let go of the impulse to try to make substantive changes to your contribution when the volume is in the proof stage. Another thing that I think is sort of maybe a benefit and also a potential concern, and again, this is me sort of speaking from my personal experience more than anything, it's that the opportunities to contribute to edited collections often come out of existing networks, informal peer groups, editors soliciting chapters, conference proceedings, and panels, rather than say an open rolling review process that a journal might have. Turnaround time for publications, the publication of an edited collection might be slower than some journals, especially if you already have a piece of written work. Going back to my quick online search this morning, some commentators argue that chapters are less accessible than articles because they are not accessible online. This appears to be a somewhat dated assessment, as edited collections are now often available online through libraries and the usual channels. I know, for example, that Raw is available through Scholar Portal books in Canada, at least. Nonetheless, it might be the case that individual chapters within collections might be less searchable than articles published in journals, which then become available and indexed through familiar databases like JSTOR and even Google Scholar. Finally, contributing to edited collections is largely unpaid work, as is being the editor of those collections. So especially for people without research funding or who are in more precarious academic positions, writing chapters can involve complicated and even emotionally fraught calculations about the value of your work, your time, and your well-being. So to conclude, I just wanted to give a final word of encouragement about writing chapters. I'm thinking here in particular of people who are, maybe junior scholars, para-academics, graduate students, and postdocs. People for whom intellectual, creative, and professional networks can be more amorphous, evasive, cliquey, and anxiety-inducing. I can say that for me, contributing to RAW, as one example, has not only been an effective way for me to get my research out there from a professional standpoint, it has also been a refreshing experience of collaboration within an industry and culture of higher education that seems to increasingly thrive on the isolation and precarity of its workers. So with that, I just want to say thank you very much for having me. Thank you to the organizers and to the School of Disability Studies at Ryerson University.
Thanks, Christien. Our next speaker is Dr. OmiSoore Dryden, and OmiSoore is the James R. Johnston Chair in Black Canadian Studies at the Faculty of Medicine and Associate Professor in Community Health and Epidemiology at Dalhousie University. Dryden has published in peer-reviewed journals and book collections and has an edited collection with Dr. Suzanne Lennon, Disrupting Queer Inclusion, Canadian Homo-Nationalisms, and the Politics of Belonging, which seeks to apply, extend, and include homo-nationalism in the Canadian context as it articulates through racialization, settler colonialism, and neoliberalism, in which contemporary articulations of sexual citizenship are not only complicit with a conservative neoliberal Canadian nation, they're also predicated on foundational Canadian national mythologies that inscribe whiteness as the embodiment of legitimate citizenship and belonging. Dryden is currently working on a new edited collection with Dr. Nicole Charles titled Black Ethnoscience Here, which aims to center transnational and diasporic Black ethnoscientific practices and methodologies in an effort to broaden perspectives on what ethnoscientific thought and method entails, while unearthing the politics of doing so as part of the transnational dialogue. Is it up to OmiSoore?
Thank you, Ricky. Am I also Zooming? People can hear me? Yes, perfect, thank you. Thank you, Ricky, for asking me to participate, and hello to everyone attending. And I just want to take a moment to give a shout out to my auntie and to honor her. Before I start, I want to give you a visual of what I look like. I am a Black queer femme woman. I have blonde locks that are currently braided. I have brown eyes. I'm wearing gold glitter eyeliner by Fenty behind cream framed glasses with red matte lipstick on thick lips and a crooked and broad smile. And I go by she, her pronouns. I currently work, live, and study in Chibuktuk, Halifax, the traditional unceded territory of the Maliseet, whose ancestors, along with the Mi'kmaq and Passamaquoddy nations, signed peace and friendship treaties with the British Crown in the 1700s. Yet we must not forget that these treaties were signed roughly 140 years before the end of slavery in this region now called Canada. Halifax was imposed upon Chibuktuk in 1749, and enslaved African people were used to dig out the roads and build the city, including much of the citadel. On the southern shore of the Bedford Basin, Mi'kmaq folks shared land with Black people, and this allowed Africville to be founded in the mid-1800s. So I acknowledge the longstanding African Nova Scotian communities, and I stand with Mi'kmaq nations, Mi'kmaqi nations and Mi'kmaq fishers. So I don't have a fully prepared written statement, but I do have some thoughts and points, and I want to, some of them I'll skip because my co-panelists have identified and mentioned similar experiences. I'm going to talk mostly about my experience on the book, on our book, Disturbing Queer Inclusion, Canadian Homo-Nationalisms and the Politics of Belonging. My colleague and friend, Suzanne Lennon, and myself co-edited this book. I was trying to think back when we first started speaking about the book, or when Suzanne first sent me a note. And I think it's in May, it was May 2011, or in and around that time, when Suzanne contacted me and said, you know, we should do some work together, and I have an idea, and let's meet and talk about it. And so the beginning discussions happened and began in 2011. And I just want to say that our book was published in October, in the fall of 2015, which was 5 years ago. And our book launch was in October 2015 in Toronto at Buddies in Bad Times, as part of a series that was happening there. The name will come back to me. So when Suzanne and I met in 2011, we were talking about, so Suzanne's work at the time was looking at the just gay subject in discourses of marriage. And I was still working on my PhD at OISE and what was CESI on blood donation and the experiences of Black queer folks with blood donation. And so this is post the Winter Olympics in Vancouver in 2010. And I'm not sure if we all remember, I had to go back and look at my notes to be reminded, and we talk about this in the introduction of our book. But that was the inaugural Pride House that happened at the Vancouver Olympics, a site where LGBTQI Olympians could go and, I guess, feel safe and be in relation with each other, like being like in a social setting with each other. And right around that same time in 2010, the group Queers Against Israeli Apartheid was formed, obviously to address Israeli apartheid. And there was significant pushback, not only from Toronto Pride, but also from the City of Toronto, that threatened to withdraw funding from Pride Toronto. These threats may sound familiar. To withdraw funding from Pride Toronto if Pride Toronto did not ban Quia from participating in Pride, either at the Dyke March or the larger parade on the Sunday. And at one point, Quia was banned. We were also, so we were thinking about these things, thinking about our research, and really wanting to engage in a conversation that disrupted the normativity, the homonormative, the homo-nationalist nature of queerness, but most specifically in Canada. So obviously we're also engaging with the work with Jasbir Puar on homo-nationalism, also thinking about queer fundamentalism, and which Ronaldo Walcott had spoken about in an interview with Wei-Sin Choi in and around the same time. And so these were the things that are in our head. So what was interesting about this is I lived in Toronto at that time, and Suzanne was living in and is living in Lethbridge, Alberta. And so we had very few times where we met in person. It's not like, you know, that was in the before time. We're now in the COVID time where we're doing things online, and we're increasing our Zoom calls and doing all these webinars online. This was well before that. And so it was often phone calls, conference calling, that kind of thing. So when she was in Toronto, we were able to get together and speak, or when there was Congress happening in Ontario, if we were going to be at Congress, at the academic yearly conference, then we would plan to meet. And so, you know, when Suzanne called me, I was honestly, I was like, why is she asking me? I didn't feel that I didn't know what I was doing. I was like, how do you edit a book? Like, I've only read edited books. You know, I'm a geek. I was doing my PhD. I loved edited books. I still do. And so you know, I was excited, but I was also terrified. I didn't know anything about publishing up until that point. I had terrifying experiences with journal articles and book chapters. And so it was something I knew I had to do, but also was feeling a lot of dread around. And so this, you know, I said yes to this book as much as I was also insecure, not only about the process, but my own academic voice. But working on the book and working with Suzanne in this collaborative way, and the collaboration is what was really important to me. It's a thing that stays with me. It's one of the reasons why I was like, yes, I'll do another edited collection. Allowed me to get clearer in my own voice and clearer in my own scholarship. But also to think differently about what it means to be in conversation with people who are writing for a book that you're putting together. You know, I want to note that our CFP was so sparse. Let me read it to you. It's this brief. This edited collection seeks to intervene in queer sexuality studies, politics, and activism in Canada. We solicit submissions that disturb Canadian homonationalisms and all their variety, and that offer a contrapuntal reading to Canadian queer nationhood, period. And then we just listed a bunch of possible topics. That was it. That was our full CFP. But it worked. And so what we would do is, you know, we would get the submissions in, and Suzanne and I would I printed off everything, and we would read everything, and then we would put together what we thought the order of the book should be. We thought we'd have different sections focusing on different things. We had an opportunity to speak about a book while we were putting it together. And we were working from the very beginning with UBC Press, and we wrote our proposal to UBC Press, and this helped us also get some clarity for ourselves, imagine what we would like, and then work towards that. And of course, the deadlines we put in that initial proposal just didn't happen. It took a long time for the work to come together, for us to be in it. We were doing different things. I was finishing a diss, I was TAing, I was, you know, so that was challenging. When we decided on authors, some authors had to withdraw. Some authors withdrew, and that was about our own missteps and our own miscommunications. We ended up spending a lot of time, not only in email, but on the phone with our contributors, talking through their chapters, encouraging them about deadlines, wanting to clarify certain sections. So we worked that closely with contributors. I know I'm running out of time, which means I'm probably sped up speaking. My apologies, I'll slow down. So let me just give you three more points. Suzanne and I wrote the introduction together, actually physically in the same space. Suzanne had invited me out to the University of Lethbridge to give a lecture and speak to grad students. And whilst there, we also worked on the book. And so we would sit across the dining room table on our laptops. I would work on a chapter, my own chapter, which is in the book. Suzanne would take a run at the introduction, and then we would share that document, and then I would go into the same document and add to the introduction. And so when you read the introduction, it really is our voice. This is how we were working on that. And it's actually a way that I love to write. The other piece is when we came down to the number of authors in our edited collection, what we would do is we shared in an anonymous way, the chapters that we wanted the chapters to speak to each other. So if we felt that chapter 1 was saying something that was also being referenced in chapter 4, we shared those chapters with the authors, removing the original author's name, and then ask them to make a direct correlation to that chapter. So when you read that, you see that in our book. And then in terms of publishing, we had a battle. We had a full battle with the publisher. We were insistent that the title be Queer Kaleidoscopes. This is what we called it in the this is what we called it in the CFP, call for papers, Queer Kaleidoscopes. We spent a lot of time thinking about it, looking it up and like looking up meanings, things like that. And so when they came back with a suggested title, we were so taken aback. The suggested title is not the title the book is now. But we were like, did they even read our book? Like, why would they come back with something so pedestrian or something so liberal? So we were like, we clutched our pearls, we were carrying on. And so we battled about that for some time. And it was a friend of ours actually who intervened with us saying, come on now, this is what the title should do. This is why the title you want is not doing that. So change your title. And then we came up with Disrupting Queer Inclusion, Canadian Homonationalisms, and the Politics of Belonging. But then we were so anxious that when we got the book cover that we were gonna have to be in the same kind of fight. So we spent all this time Googling potential images and looking. But then the book cover came. I'm holding up my book, our book, and we loved it. I don't know if you can see it because I have a background on. We loved it. We loved the kaleidoscope visual that they were able to capture in the cover. And so it was a nice treat at the end to have a cover that we really loved. We kind of fell off on making sure that we were nominated for books and things like book awards and things like that. We kind of missed some deadlines, and that's because we were just so overwhelmed with the process. But we do know that the book has been used in a variety of classes. In some ways, it speaks back to the 2012 book, Queerly Canadian. We wanted to say that conversations around settler colonialism and systemic racism are queer issues. And we felt that what we were seeing up until that moment in kind of normative queer studies, sexuality studies programs was this question, is racism even a queer issue? And so the way in which it kind of shows up in homonationalism and nationalisms and homonormativity. So I think I'm well over my time. So I'll stop there. I'm looking forward to the questions and more conversation where I can provide some more specific examples. Thank you again.
Thanks, initially. Our next speaker is Ben Daly. Ben Daly is a fashion educator, a scholar, and an activist who is devoted to justice in fashion, education, and the fashion industry. As chair of fashion at Ryerson University, Ben is leading the department through a deep transformation by embedding inclusion, decolonization, and sustainability into the curriculum and culture. He is an associate professor of equity, diversity, and inclusion in fashion, who teaches courses that range from lectures on fashion theory to studios on design justice. He has been awarded over $1.5 million from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council to support his research program that explores the intersectional fashion experiences of disabled, fat, trans, and queer people, and collaborates with them to co-design clothing and fashion media. Ben holds a PhD from Cambridge University.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Ricky. I'm really thrilled to be here. I've already learned so much from our panelists and from this conversation. So my name is Ben Barry. I go by he, him pronouns. Before I begin, I want to give you a visual description of what I look like. I'm a queer femme white man of Jewish descent. I have short brown hair, a brown beard, a crooked smile, and set back brown eyes. And I wear clear circular glasses. I have low vision, and so I'm holding my speaking notes quite close to my eyes tonight. I'm also wearing a very glittering, shiny silver sweater. I'm the co-editor of Crossing Gender Boundaries. And this was the first collection I had ever edited. The book is about how fashion creates, disrupts, and transcends gender. And it takes an approach to fashion that challenges the idea that fashion was born in Europe, in Paris, a narrative that we hear all too often, and instead recognizes fashion as existing in cultures, in indigenous cultures, since time immemorial. Now, this book took 5 years from idea to publication. And tonight, what I'd like to do is speak with you about 3 themes: the book's inception, the writing and publication process, and some of my thoughts on the outcome of the book once it's been in the world. So, the book's inception. I was approached by Dr. Andrew Riley with the idea for this book. Andy is a professor of fashion at the University of Hawaii, and he had the initial concept of creating a book on fashion and the transcendence of gender. And he invited me to collaborate with him as a co-editor. Andy approached me at an international conference, an annual conference in fashion studies, after hearing a paper that I delivered, and after recently reading a paper that I had written in the journal that he edits. Now, Andy is a full professor. He's editor of a journal called Critical Studies in Men's Fashion, and he's already edited 4 collections on fashion and identity. And at this time, I was in my very first year of a tenure track job at Ryerson. I had no experience with academic publishing or editing collections. And so this was really a chance for me to learn and be mentored by someone in my field with incredible experience in this work. Now, both of us taught courses, both theory and design-based courses on gender and fashion. And we really realized that there wasn't a primer overview on the topic of gender, intersectionality, and fashion. And often if gender was discussed, it was limited to a single chapter or journal article. And so we thought as educators, there was a need for a primer on fashion and gender for senior undergraduates and graduate students, and particularly for students who do practice-based research, design-based research. And so our goal was to explore the creation, the changes, and the overthrow of gender through fashion and clothing. And we wanted to present multiple and parallel histories and narratives using diverse methodologies and theoretical frameworks. And so we began the process by exploring the interest of two publishers who both specialize in the field of fashion studies. Andy had existing relationships with both of them, having published edited collections with them in the past. So both publishers were quite interested in the book, but had very different perspectives on what it should look like. One publisher wanted a collection of about 7 or 8 longer essays, and the publisher that we chose, Intellect Books, wanted a collection of 15 shorter essays. And we both felt more comfortable with Intellect's approach because we wanted to bring in more voices and more perspectives into this edited collection. So one of the first things we discussed as co-editors was the division of work. And we decided that Andy would be the lead contact for all of the authors, and I would be the lead contact with the publisher. Second, we decided to write and then share our call for papers. And we said in that call that Intellect was interested in the volume and that we were looking for chapters. And we had already thought about 3 sections for the book, and we put that down in the call for chapters. The 3 sections were going to be fashion to create gender, fashion to disrupt gender, and fashion to transcend gender. And we asked authors to identify which section they thought their piece might best fit into. So we shared this call on social media, our networks, and with fashion studies associations. And we received about 50 submissions. We reviewed the submissions and accepted about 10 of them. We then reached out and invited 5 other scholars who we knew, really to ensure that the book had the inclusion of the voices and perspectives that we wanted. And so in total, we had 15 contributors and 15 chapters. We provided detailed feedback on all of the abstracts for the accepted authors, and we asked them to revise and resubmit. And then we put together the revised abstracts into a proposal for Intellect. The proposal was sent to review, and based on the review, Intellect offered us an advanced contract. So when we move on to the publication process, once the book had an advanced contract, we provided guidelines to our authors, and we gave them a full year to prepare and submit the first drafts of their chapters. And so in this guideline, we asked each author to provide 2 to 3 images in their chapter and let them know that they had to secure permissions. This was something we had discussed with the publisher ahead of time. We also provided a brief description of the section that their chapter would be in and the abstracts of other chapters in the section, so they would be able to situate their chapter in that conversation. And we made an intentional choice not to specify a unifying theoretical approach. Instead, we were open to the theoretical approach that each author wanted to use. We decided not to ground the volume in one framework because we wanted to introduce a range of theories on fashion and gender to our readers. Andy and I both reviewed the first drafts of the chapters and provided comments. And we wrote our introduction last, after we read the first drafts of all of the chapters. We also knew the cover image that we wanted for the book because we referenced the designer in our introduction. And again, this is the cover, if you can see it. It's an image of a Black person who's looking sideways Their gender cannot be easily categorized into the binary based on their clothing. They're wearing a white puffy shirt, a puffy furry vest, and a white baseball cap with a solid white veil covering their face. It's an image from a campaign for a Toronto-based non-binary designer named Mick Carter. And Mick actually teaches our non-binary fashion course at the School of Fashion and our thesis course. We then submitted the chapters, the images, the permissions to Intellect for peer review. The peer review took about 6 to 8 months. And once we got the reviews back, we went over them all in detail, and we wrote each author an editor's summary to help guide them through the review. We offered our suggestions of what comments to focus on and which ones they could perhaps ignore. We then sent back the finalized manuscripts to the publisher, and the book only went to peer review once. However, we did ask the publisher to send our introduction back to peer review because we had very conflicting comments about how we had situated the introduction. So all of this took much longer than we thought. It took about 2 years, given our schedules and the schedules of the authors. We also originally submitted, as I said, 15 chapters, but one author had to drop out following peer review because of their schedule. And so we ended up with 14 chapters in addition to our introduction, which was the length of a chapter. Once we sent back the final manuscript to the publisher, we went through the process of cover design and page proofs. And as a practice-based fashion researcher, this was one of the most fun parts for me. I really enjoyed the cover design and having the chance to work with the cover designer. The cover designer read our introduction, reviewed the chapters, and selected a typeface to best represent it. And the typeface that was selected was designed to honor the rainbow flag creator, Gilbert Baker. The typeface is called Gilbert, and it follows the design language of the rainbow flag. Each character features a combination of vivid colors from the flag. And our designer updated the design to include the colors of the revised flag with black and brown stripes. And this highlighted the intersectional approach that we were honoring and taking in the volume. And I enjoyed to see how theory and practice, theory and creative really came together here in the design of the cover. And at this stage in the process, we also received really exciting news that Intellect had submitted our book to a project called Knowledge Unlatched. And it's a UK program that provides funding for scholarly publishers to make work freely accessible through open access. And our book was awarded funding to make it fully accessible. And so there's a digital version that's freely available for everyone. So in January 2020, the book was published and officially made it into the world. And the open access version went live in March. And I think one of the things that worked really well with working with Intellect on this volume was that they're very connected with the fashion studies community. And that was really a massive benefit because the book was able to be front and center at all of our annual conferences, certainly before the pandemic. And because of the pandemic, the physical marketing was cut short. But because the publisher has such a strong network in fashion studies, I've heard from colleagues that the book is already making its way into our community and being used in many courses. I've also seen some of the first reviews in journals of the book, and it's certainly interesting as the editor to see what reviewers choose to focus on. There's been praise for the structure and the organization and the narratives, and critique that there's a lack of color images, particularly for a fashion book, which obviously is a huge cost for a publisher, and that would be carried on to the reader. But through this process, my biggest learning was not having training or not preparing to think about marketing myself, not thinking about how to promote the book or how I could support the authors in the book to promote it. And I'm currently working on a new edited collection with Intellect called The Fashion Activist, Transforming Fashion Education and Ending Body Oppression. And as I prepare for this volume, I'm certainly interested in learning how to better promote an edited collection. And hopefully that's a topic that maybe we can discuss more in the question and answer period. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ben. I'm going to ask all the presenters to come back on if possible. Hi, everyone. That was really hopefully informative for everyone. There's a lot of information there which I'm sure will require some time to digest and process. I was hoping that maybe we could have a conversation amongst the five of us and see if there are any questions that we have for each other. And then we will open up a conversation to the rest of the audience in the next 5 minutes. So, any questions, comments for each other, conflict, remarks? I suppose I have I guess I can start. I have a question for both OmiSoore and also Ben, because you will participate in your own processes. I was wondering how if you had to deal with conflict in your work of organizing an edited collection. So I know conflict is something that comes up often in a project that has multiple bodies playing and working together. So I was wondering how and if you had to deal with conflict in your respective projects.
Yes, a lot. Susanna and I actually, we had a few, really intense kinds of things, but we're able to kind of work through those. And it's the thing that actually helped facilitate our relationship as friends, because we were able to work through those. It wasn't like, I hate you, I don't want to speak to you again, we're not doing this book. It ended up being something that we were like, let's put the book aside and let's figure out what happened here. And because we don't want, this is not how we want to do this, right? And we really wanted to be those feminist lesbians who were like, how do we work through this shit that happened, and then to make sure we're okay, and then how do we go beyond that, right? So then how do we go back to the book? We did it successfully and unsuccessfully, I think, with some of the authors, which is indicative of who's not in the book and who should be in the book, and like things like that. We got the peer reviews. We did the first round of peer reviews. We did a cursory look, and we kind of just sent them off, as opposed to what Ben was talking about in terms of how do you how do you go through them, providing some direction. Like, we just did cursory kind of directions, and that, and for some that was a misstep on our part, in terms of, because we had already been working so closely with the contributors and with our authors, that we should have also been working, worked more closely before just kind of setting up the peer reviews. And again, that caused some harm and some missteps. And even though we repaired that with authors individually, some authors just didn't come back to the book. Like this happens. Our debate with UBC around the title, I think Mercury was retrograde. And so we were just really at it. We were just like, I was ready to take it into the streets. I was like, what are you talking? I was not having it. And it really was because we had a friend of ours and a colleague kind of step in and be like, no, this is not a good title. Think of a different title. And so, because, the thing I think is that, the thing I know is that, Susanna and I we really fought for just some of the images and some of the pieces. We don't have many images in the book. Some of the images came from folks who were incarcerated. And then by the time the book was published, they were no longer incarcerated. So then it was like, well, you need to find them to sign permissions. It's like, we can't find them. We're not in contact in this way, right? Like the relationship has changed. So the permission that we got signed at the beginning, can we still use that? Like there were things that we were trying to do that weren't kind of like normative in terms of how we put the book together. And so we wanted to fight on behalf of our authors for that. Yeah, I think, I like what Ben was saying about, publishing and marketing the book. I think if Twitter now was what it was, it'd be everywhere. Like, I just put it everywhere. But yeah, so that's how we did some of that.
I guess in my response, I think there's always conflict and collaboration, usually. And certainly I think with Andy and I, there were different chapters we were very excited about and probably polarized on. There were some abstracts I really wanted and he didn't want, and vice versa. And a lot of it came down to sort of compromise, that we sort of would pick our favorite and recognize that there's different merits and each gets our way with particular chapters. And some of it we saw the other person's perspective, and some of it we had completely different viewpoints, but respected that chapter would do the work for different people. And every chapter, I think the learning for me in that conflict was that every chapter didn't have to speak to everyone, that some chapters would do work for some folks and other chapters would do work for other folks, and that the conflict between them we could address in the introduction, and that conflict between them made the book a whole. And so that was my biggest learning, is that having chapters that conflict, that challenge, that rub up against each other in particular ways worked to bring what we were trying to do with the book to life. That was probably the main learning. I think the second learning was working with authors to recognize that the main audience for the book were fashion students, were senior undergraduates and graduates who were primarily in practice-based versus theory and research-based programs, and ensuring that the chapters were written in a voice and had application to those particular folks. And that was some conflict with particular authors who were accustomed to writing for more traditional scholars and journals. And so working with them to rephrase and sort of reposition and reframe chapters and language to really support the audience that we had intended.
I found, for me, what I found about the whole process was how humbling it was. Because as academics or activists or people with certain kinds of expertise, there's this idea that they know everything and that they don't need help. But I think for me, I approached this as really a learning experience, and I quickly realized that there's a lot that I don't know, and there's a lot that I need to be open to learning, and that there are people who are out there to help me and support me in the work, and that it's also okay to ask for help and also say, I don't know how to do that, or I'm not really sure, how that would work or how this would work. I think, it's really, really important to find opportunities to feel like you're part of a community. I really believe, and I think I mentioned this to Karen once, I think it really takes a whole village to put this a book like this. And I don't ever look at it as something that I just did. I think it has the capacity to bring lots of different people in conversation with each other. And I think it's really important to be open to that conversation. So, yeah. Anyone else?
I would love to talk a little bit about the marketing and promotion side and how my fellow panelists sort of attempted or worked through that. And I'd obviously love to know from the publisher's perspective on how you advice for authors, for co-editors or editors, of what your recommendations are, because as I said sort of in my remarks, that was my biggest challenge. I felt the book is in the world and it's great, but I don't know what else to do. And so I'd love to hear about your experiences and also advice from a publisher.
UBC asked us to fill out UBC Press had a whole form and thing. I'm sure you had one as well in terms of, before, obviously around audience, but after in terms of, writing the blurbs for the book, like, the long blurb, the short blurb, all of these things. Oh, it was so overwhelming. And they were really helpful with the book launches. And so Glad Day, who in Toronto, that was hosting an event where we launched the first time they held the book fair, where we launched the book at Buddies in Bad Times. It was packed, and UBC Press really helped with that. And then we had online. We had a launch, so that was a Toronto launch. We had a Lethbridge launch that I called into, and so Zoomed about that. And then we had an author meet and greet at Congress, I think in Calgary, when Congress was in Calgary, and we signed off some books and things like that. You put it online, but that was kind of it. Like, it didn't dawn on me, I think, really to think through like Lambda or like other places. I think we could have put the book, and we should have, right? Like, I think we should have put our book there. I think our book did something really unique and interesting in 2015. And I know some people are still using it now, and maybe we'll do something for 2025 as an update or a different conversation. Hey, Suzanne. But I don't know. I think that's kind of what we did. It feels beyond me, actually. So it's a good question, because I'm working on another one. So what do we do? I want to make sure we don't miss that.
I can say a few words from the publisher's stance. I always hesitate when I send what we call the AP form, the author publicity form, because it keeps growing and growing. Our publicists and our marketing people keep adding things. But one thing that is paramount is the keywords, what we call the metadata. if we don't have good metadata, a book is not discoverable. And we all know there's fewer chances and opportunities, unfortunately, to wander into a bookstore and come across a book. It's through Google searches and databases. So we are now up to asking for a minimum of 60 keywords and really carefully thinking about those words. And also, when the publisher asks for what we call comp titles, those comparable titles, to really carefully think of your book in a bookstore. What books would it be next to? And to really give quite a bit of thought to that, because it helps our booksellers. We get 1 minute, 2 minutes tops when we're pitching a book. And so it's really important to work on that pitch. And so those comp titles can be really important in that moment. So you all know this book does the same or similar thing, but it takes it off into this direction or something like that. In terms of what authors can do, and again, as Christien said, I often feel badly about asking authors to do this, because again, it's that unpaid labor that we're, as acquiring editors, I'm well aware of that. But I don't know, unless the university subsidizes university presses to ensure that we can continue to disseminate the knowledge. We're at this place where we're having to recuperate or break even our costs. And it's such a difficult environment. It's an exciting one, but it's a difficult one. So what our authors are asked to do often is op-eds. So if you see something that's happening in the media and you are the person, or you're one of the people who can speak to that moment, to write a 500-word op-ed and send it in for consideration with that bio line of, you're the author or the editor of X collection. That really is one of the ways to increase your, I don't know if it really lends itself to sales, but it's really important to, again, get on the radar. You'll notice, right, the media continues to go back to people they already know. And so that's one of the ways to become one of those talking heads, if that's something you're looking to do to increase your profile. And unfortunately, that does help with book sales. Another thing is those deadlines that we've heard. I agree. It's projects are on the back burner forever. I have something and then it's in the back corner. It's not on the front burner. So I just don't have the time in the day to give it my attention. But then suddenly, the managing editor or whoever it is saying we're ready. And then it's like, go, go, go. Because what we're trying to do is we're orchestrating so many projects with so many people, and we're trying to hit our pub dates. But even though the pub date may still be 6 months away, I spoke of it earlier, these ideas of long leads. Usually academic titles aren't given too many long leads, but our press has really been trying to work on more of a trade publisher schedule, because the media won't even give us a sniff of any attention if we don't have an ARC, an advanced reading copy, or a galley to send them like 6 months in advance. Like, we're talking about, we just had the Frankfurt Book Fair, so we're talking about books that are just ideas right now, but it's important to have those ideas as early as possible and start, planting those seeds. And then the media sort of knows about it, they've heard about it. And so then they come back to you and they're interested when we're finally ready with the book. One other thing I'll say, it's just an easy thing, but it's an obvious thing. And Ricky did it well with somehow pulling off like the 10-year anniversary of Tim Dean and that collection, that work. The media loves like anniversaries. The media needs us to feed them content. They're always looking for a story. And unfortunately, because of our nature, we like things like anniversaries. We like things like, this is a historic day. So if you can think of anything where you're casting your net into the future, but you're thinking, you know what, if we get all those essays in by this date and we do a year, we are looking, you know, forward to that anniversary. And it doesn't hurt, it doesn't always work, but again, it helps sometimes when we're just throwing our pitches out to the media, like, we got this and this anniversary is coming up, what do you think? And it sounds superficial, and it is, but that is kind of that bridge to that world that the academic publishers are trying to do more of, to get your work out there and seen.
Thanks a lot, Karen, for the comments and also for the questions that Ben and initially asked. I kind of we only have a little bit more time, so I want to let get some questions from the audience, and I think there are 2 questions from the participants that have been typed in the chat already. I'm just looking back at the chat right now and seeing there is I think Daly might be able to.
I can read them out if that's works for people. So let me just find. So one of them was for OmiSoore from Chloe. What is the concept that you spoke about, queer fundamentalism?
Thank you for that. It helps me respond to an oversight I had earlier. So, gosh, I wish I could remember the magazine that Ronaldo Walcott and Wayson Choi were being interviewed in. It was just after marriage was a victory. And the question was, you know, what's the next queer war? And so in that conversation, both Wayson and Ronaldo were speaking, and Ronaldo spoke about the next queer war would be a civil war because of the fundamentalism of lesbian, gay, bisexual normative practices. And so he was likening it to kind of religious fundamentalism, you know, conservative fundamentalism. And he spoke about queer fundamentalism. And it's a term that I really picked up on because it was a thing that was irritating to me, that there were good gays and bad queers. And if you're a bad queer, then, you know, you needed to either get in line or get out of the way. And so, so that's what I'm gesturing to. And the oversight is that Ronaldo Walcott wrote the foreword to our book, this Disrupting Queer Inclusion. And it was a beautiful indication of his support, not only of me and my colleague in our research. He was my supervisor at the time, and I think of him dearly, but also of our work. So I missed that before, and I want to say that now. So thank you for the question.
Okay. And we have one other question from Celie for Ben. I've noticed a current invite to a survey or interview for queer and disabled men and masculine identified people refashioned in Ontario. I'm quite interested, but in Montreal. Any notes on the project specifics are welcome.
Thank you for that question. It's a question about a recruitment for my new research project called Cripping Masculinity, that's about co-creating clothing and fashion shows and exhibitions with disability identified men and masculine identified folks. We are open to participants now across Canada because we've moved many of our activities virtually. So please email us at crippingmasculinity.com. and all the information is there. So yeah, it'll be wonderful if you would get in touch.
If Are there any other questions that anyone wants to ask? Any final comments or remarks? If not, then I just want to thank all the folks who attended. I am really glad for the people who showed up. I also wanted to thank all the wonderful panelists who participated in this event. It's left me with lots of things to think about. I hope it's left everyone else a lot to think about. I hope that this is also the beginning of a series of conversations down the line about the publishing industry. I also want to thank Esther at the School of Disability Studies and my colleagues at the School of Disability Studies for supporting this event. It's been something that's been planned for the last couple of months, and I'm really happy that it's finally happened. I also want to take a moment to thank Yonah and Angie Lang, who helped with the ASL interpretation, and also Angie for the live captions, and also Daly for the support with the Zoom webinar. Much like an edited collection, a Zoom webinar is a collective community affair. And I hope that all of you have a wonderful, wonderful evening. And thanks again so much for coming out and supporting us in this conversation. Bye, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.
Thanks,
Good night.
everyone. Thank you.
Everyone. Take good care.